Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hello, everybody. Welcome, one and all, to another installment of your favorite alternate history podcast, A Fork in Time. You are listening to the sultry voice and also the world's most humble podcaster, Evan Buck. And I will obligatorily give my intro, even though I am in the host chair today. I never want to forget my signature greeting. Hey everyone, how's it going? It's your boy Evan. Now that we've gotten that formality out of the way, I will introduce in no particular order the other esteemed gentlemen who are joining me for today's misadventure, ? We'll see where it goes. But on my immediate right, we have Chris Coppola.
Hi, good people.
We then, to his right, on my screen, have Dylan Holzmer.
It's me, Jessica.
I don't know what happened there, guys. And then to his right, and last but certainly not least, my esteemed friend, Kai McAllister.
Hey, it's Kai, the history guy. Just trying that one out.
Ooh, I kind of like that. It's like Bill Nye the Science Guy, and
Bill Nye the Science Guy.
You are
Bill Kai the history guy.
Yeah, I don't know, which is honestly ironic because your line of work is in toxicology and pharmacology, so you are actually more of a science guy by trade. But anyway, we'll see.
By night.
History guy by night. Yeah, we'll see if that sticks. But anyway, today we are going to be engaging in a veritable, I don't really even know what to call it, but it's going to be a pretty big fork. It's one that has come up quite a bit in alternate history circles and discussions, and I'm going to leave our possible threatened plans just depending on how this goes. But suffice it to say, we've had almost an hour of pre-discussion on this topic.
And that's on the Zoom.
And that's on the Zoom.
Not the what is this, 2-3 days we've been cooking
pre on the Slack discussion. So understand, dear listeners, we amateur historians have been quite studious on this for all of your sake, because we want to make sure we handle this topic well. And so I'm going to turn over the reins to none other than Chris Coppola to help set up the fork and what we're going to be discussing today.
So today's fork is basically Lenin not taking the sealed train to Petrograd. Dylan, was it a sealed train?
It was not. They took a night stop in Frankfurt to see the sights.
So it wasn't quite sealed, but basically, and by the way, just for everybody's sake, all of the dates we are going to use are going to be new system, our system. Right in the middle of this, in January 1918, Russia adopts a different calendar. So whenever you're looking at this, you'll see some dates that are 2 weeks before the other dates. Everything we're doing will be new system. In other words, dates we are all familiar with. And that's why what I'm about to say happens, because on International Women's Day, which is March 8th, 1917, there is a protest in Petrograd that the government winds up calling out troops, and they wind up firing on the protesters. That's the beginning. Remember, March 8th, 1917, beginning of the February Revolution, for the reason I just explained. This leads very quickly to the abdication of the Tsar and the establishment of a provisional government. Once this happens, Imperial Germany sits there and says, in our timeline, let's stir that pot. And they make contact with some Russian political figures, exiles, intellectuals,
Rabble-rousers.
rabble-rousers, revolutionaries, and say, hey, how'd you guys like to go back and get a piece of this revolution thing?
Say you want a revolution.
And basically put them on a train that takes it's a weird circuitous route because it stopped in Frankfurt, then goes to Sweden, up through Finland, and comes into, we're going to say, Petrograd.
Why did that have to happen? Because understand, dear listeners, we're in the middle of the Great War at this point. If you're unfamiliar, that's World War I. But there was no World War II at that point, so it's called the Great War. So we had to go through an ostensibly neutral country, Switzerland, because Germany is basically transferring Russian revolutionaries in the middle of a conflict with said country. So,
and basically looking back on this, I mean, we all, we don't need to go into too much of the what wound up happening. We're going to jump back and forth around that because, Lenin goes to Russia, Soviet Union becomes a thing, kind of dictates the entire history of a good part of the 20th century. But here's the thing that we always want to keep in mind. These Russian revolutionaries were socialist communist. They were very lefty. They are not exactly whose circles the Prussian militarists that are running Germany at this time roll with. And the idea, in our pre-discussions was, why wouldn't Imperial Germany want Russia knocked out of the war? They would. It's just, they look at these revolutionaries, they look at Lenin and say, maybe this isn't the way we want it done. Churchill, writing about this, described Lenin as a plague bacillus that was unleashed on Russia. And I think that's a good description because when he makes the Soviet Union happen, what that does for radicals throughout Europe is it completely changes the game. And it makes them a lot more realistic and a lot more powerful. Meaning, if you fast forward 2 years, these German Prussian generals that are deciding to send Lenin to Russia are going to be fighting in the streets against the German version of Lenin. So they decide in our timeline, let him enjoy his coffee. No need to interrupt him. Because the possible blowbacks, when has the government ever thought about blowbacks? But in this case, they sit there and realize, you know what? Maybe this cure is worse than the disease. And do not send Lenin back to Russia. Now, we're going to get into this quickly. There's other people that make their way to Petrograd and similar leaders that are going to wind up affecting things from here on out. So where do people want to start?
Yeah.
So I guess the big thing to note is who's on the train and who is in Moscow and who isn't in Moscow at this point if Lenin's train doesn't go.
Petrograd.
Sorry, Petrograd. My bad.
You
so much talk about Moscow. Yeah.
You corrected me on the sealed train. I had to come back with that. I'm like,
you're right. Sorry.
We know it wasn't sealed, but
yeah. So
maybe they could have used some flex tape to seal it.
Yeah, right. So Lenin is in Switzerland. So are a bunch of other kind of German, Polish, and Soviet Russian kind of socialist revolutionaries. So Lenin's the big name because obviously of what happens later. Gregory Zinoviev, who is also a big Bolshevik and just generally communist revolutionary, is on the train. One of the last members of the German Spartacus League from pre-World War I believe, is on the train, or one no. There's a German socialist.
Spartacus League comes after.
You're right. Spartacus League comes after this. Yeah. There's a German socialist. There's a couple of Poles. But these are the guys who are on the train. Who isn't on the train, who also shows up, Trotsky ends up showing up in May, basically like 3 weeks, 4 weeks after Lenin would end up getting back in April. Trotsky was in New York. He tries to sail back home when he hears about the February/March revolution. He gets intercepted by the Canadians. He hangs out in Nova Scotia for a little bit, and then the provisional Russian government asks for him back. So he gets back into Petrograd shortly after Lenin would arrive in this new timeline we're explaining. Also coming back from the opposite direction, from the Russian wastes of Siberia, is Lev Kamenev, who is probably the other kind of big name that wasn't as big in our timeline, but might end up being important here. So we kind of have some people you know, some people you don't know who are in Petrograd, and some people you definitely know who aren't in Petrograd as of basically early May 1917. So this is in the midst of a provisional government that's headed by, kind of the sort of the biggest liberal Democrat in Russia in Alexander Kerensky, who is, kind of head of the provisional government, and also, I think, the vice chair of the Petrograd Soviet. Quick kind of detour to explain how the heck government is working in Russia right now that there's no czar. The official Russian, semi-official, the closest thing to official that you have for all of Russia is the Russian provisional government. You also, for St. Petersburg, Petrograd specifically, which is the capital of the Russian Empire, have the Petrograd Soviet, which was actually founded a year or two before this, but now is coming in as a actual political governing entity. It's like 4,000 people. Basically, it's the sort of workers' council, the more socialist kind of city version of the quote unquote overall government of Russia, the provisional government. They kind of bump heads, sort of co-govern at this point, but the provisional government is kind of like Thor at the end of Avengers Endgame with Chris Pratt on the Guardians of the Galaxy ship. Imagine the Thor is the Petrograd Soviet, Chris Pratt is the provisional government. They're standing next to each other and they're like, we know who's really in charge, right? We know who's really in charge. It's totally.
And the Petrograd Soviet is the most important, but there are Soviets all over Russia. Everybody is forming their own committees to run local affairs.
Yes.
There are Soviets in the army, in every factory, all over. People are just kind of saying, all right, we're in charge now. And that's what Soviets are. So, and I'm not even going to get into Lvov. But there was technically somebody else who was in charge, and then he failed. Kerensky comes in as somebody else because they're trying to basically, I think the view is very much that Kerensky is kind of a responsible, kind of a reasonable revolutionary socialist type that we can do business with. We can bring him in, and he's not going to burn the house down around us. Now, that's one way of looking at it. I think Kai was saying another way of like once he's in, he gets some kind of imperial pretensions.
Yeah. I mean, Kerensky initially, when he came to power, was actually quite popular. He had a good mandate to lead. But of course, as things were, the situation in Russia was just too chaotic. We talked about it a little bit at the very beginning of the episode, but this is all taking place as World War II is starting to come to, I guess you could say, a close. But it's getting really bad, and nowhere is it
World
worse
War
than
World War One.
I'm sorry, did I say World War II? I meant World War One.
Yeah, I knew what you
didn't mean
meant.
to jump wars. Yeah,
Yeah.
But you've got a really interesting point of like talking about legitimacy. Because nobody, even Kerensky, even the cadets, even the people we recognize as like Western Democrats are just party leaders who are standing there saying, I represent the people. I should like be their voice and will. Nobody has been elected. There have never been elections. The government is just the people who happen to be in Petrograd making speeches and convincing those people. And we're going to get to a point where there is kind of an election, but nobody here has real legitimacy. It's all kind of a sense of popular, but
Yeah. Yeah.
you know,
Nobody's
Like,
in,
yeah,
he's not
as
facing.
we said, this is a very tense, chaotic situation in which Kerensky is trying to form some sort of functional something of a government. He just wants to build something that can actually survive and function. And the problems arise from the fact that Russia is, as I said, being absolutely hammered in World War One. I think the statistics, if I remember correctly, are 1 out of every 3 Russian soldiers sent to the front line is dying. So you're having a massive backlash against being involved in World War One. There's food shortages. There's all sorts of government tensions going on. Nobody knows what's going on. The people want the Constituent Assembly. Is that what it's called? Constituent Assembly?
yeah, the provisional government.
The provisional government. They really want those elections to take place for a whole host of reasons. They're not. And so in our timeline, the Kerensky government falls when the Bolsheviks storm the Winter Palace. They basically seize power and stuff. But I am positing that the real instigator of all of this is Vladimir Lenin. And without his presence there, it seems to me conceivable, if not likely, that the Kerensky government is able to perhaps consolidate more without those rabble-rouser Bolshevik Lenin-led agitators at their doorstep, making every decision, every day a living nightmare for them. They're able to focus more on consolidating power. And then that brings us to what constituted a large debate for us in the pre-discussion, which is how a Kerensky government, which survives beyond November of 1917, handles the exit, or lack thereof, from World War One.
And by the way, I just want to put one other thing out there. A lot of us look at World War One, and we're going to get to this on another point. Look at the Russian army as a basket case, and to some extent, it was kind of like the Dallas Cowboys. They haven't won anything in a long time.
Gosh, Chris knows how much I love roasting the Dallas Cowboys.
No, I don't. No offense, Evan. I could care less. I love it too. So, but the point I'm getting at is France, who was good at doing war, also faced their big mutinies like a month after the Tsar abdicates. So, spring of 1917, the Western Front, the French, the British are also realizing that we can't keep attacking. We're facing our own internal problems because of this. So it's not just a Russia problem, but France solved it a very specific way, which was, we're just going to sit in our trenches. And this was one of the demands of the French mutineers. They openly said, we will go in the line and we will shoot people that come towards us. We're just not going to go towards them. And so I think that's one of the things we discussed as a really good way for the Russian government to handle this. Is that fair?
Definitely fair.
I would agree.
Clarify why what Chris is saying is important, is obvious for those who study this, but just to put it out there, in our timeline, Vladimir Lenin takes power on the promise that he will end World War One, or end Russia's involvement in World War One. Allow the Constituent Assembly votes to take place, give land, bread, and freedom to the Russian peasants.
Land, bread, peace.
Land, bread, and peace. Thank you. He provides that promise. He fulfills that promise by ending the war, signing the
Brest-Litovsk
pact, which essentially removes Russia from the war entirely. We're positing a Kerensky government surviving doesn't do a pact like that, but instead pulls a France and just says, we're going to dig a trench and we're just basically going to enforce that trench. No one goes past us, but we're not going to offend anybody else. We're not going to do any offensives. And so in effect, there's no pact that officially withdraws Russia from the war, but functionally, it still frees up German troops to do what they've wanted to do, which is mobilize to the Western Front and fight to defeat France, England, and the United States.
Not as much. Not as
Yeah,
much.
not as much.
Not as
at
much,
least
but
some.
but more so than they were
More
before
so
that.
than in our timeline.
The
Yeah.
other
And
thing
yeah,
that
sorry, go ahead,
I
Chris.
want to talk about is the turnip winter.
Yes.
This isn't just the idea. There's more to this than just we're going to stay in the war and not lose. Not so much Russia, but one of the things that Britain has done is put an embargo on Germany and say, you cannot, we're not going to let anything in. That leads to mass starvation in Germany. And in a lot of ways, looking at what winds up happening a year later in the fall and summer of 1918, it is that mass starvation in Germany that leads to the end of the war. So surviving actually is a strategy here, where if we can just stay in this, Germany can't feed itself. It will eventually collapse. There's a point to not pushing them. We can still win if we adopt that strategy.
Absolutely. And something that I want to throw in here as a possibility as well is, I'm just going to say, for the sake of our listeners, I, in the pre-podcast, tried my best to try and get a scenario happen, which is one that I think we'll eventually cover at some point on the podcast. And that is the, reemergence or reascendance of the Romanovs into power, the Tsardom. I'm just going to say, with what we discussed, I don't think that's going to happen here. I don't think that's a possibility. But what I do think is interesting, because I mean, let's be real. In our timeline, what essentially happened with the abdication of the Tsar is he had appointed, I think, I forget what exactly his relationship was, but it's Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich.
This is uncle, I think.
I think it's his uncle or something like that. Yeah. And he was like, fourth in line. And then they had, family members die. So he became third, second. And so he's the heir apparent. And basically what Tsar Nicholas II does is he's like, okay, this crap is getting way too crazy for me. I can't handle this anymore. I'm abdicating and I'm giving it to a guy who has literally done everything he possibly can to not want the throne. This guy tried to marry out of the Russian royal family. He did whatever he could to try and not take power. So then, when he becomes the Tsar apparent, he's just like, you know what? I'm just going to wait for the Constituent Assembly to vote on this. And conveniently for this guy who doesn't want to be Tsar, the Constituent Assembly never gets around to it. So he's more than happy to deal with that. Kerensky comes in, puts him under house arrest, and eventually Michael ends up becoming becoming the first member of the Romanov royal family to get shot by the Bolsheviks. In this timeline, I think we still have the same dynamics happening where the Tsar abdicates. He puts Michael up as the heir apparent. Michael doesn't want to do anything. But without the factor of the Bolsheviks coming in and just wiping out all of their opposition, essentially, I think, we have Tsar Nicholas out in his Russian villa somewhere. We have Michael just doing Michael things, maybe trying to go and live in exile in Paris or something. What I will say is, while I don't see the Tsars coming and the Romanovs coming back to power in any way or any stretch, I do think that an organization that I happen to find a very interesting one is going to cause some degree of trouble, and that's the Black Hundreds. The Black Hundreds, for those who aren't familiar, are like very, ultra nationalist, pro-Russian, pro-czarist, and at this point, they were essentially a pro-czarist terrorist group. Without, Michael being eventually shot by the Bolsheviks, as long as there is a Romanov to look to, no matter how unwilling he might be to lead, I think there's still going to be a certain degree or number of Russians who want to go back to the quote unquote good old days. So I'm just going to throw out here and posit for everyone, and we might return to this loose thread later and see how that might change things. But I think the Black Hundreds are still going to be a problem, and they're not going to be wiped out. And in fact, they may end up running in elections.
So
That's kind of how I see them
the
winding
forces
up.
that the Black Hundreds, I don't think are going anywhere. The one thing I'm going to say is, I said to Dylan earlier that for some reason we always pick the it's about to get real point in a revolution to do our dual forks.
Yeah.
And this is very similar to the Flight to Varennes, where right up until then, everyone was fine with Louis staying on the throne as long as he doesn't have any power. And I, especially, hey, that kind of solved why France doesn't have an opinion on this, but Britain still has an opinion on the Tsar. He is still their cousin. And I think because they are in a war together, I think that, I know this sounds a little weird, but yes, the socialist revolutionary Kerensky is okay with a Romanov on the throne if the Romanov on the throne one isn't like just literally so incompetent and so messing up the war effort that people think they are a Russian or are a German agent. They look at this and say, you could not be doing worse if you were trying to.
Well, I think so. Kerensky declares the Russian. So Michael is the sort of emperor in waiting, pending the asterisk of approval by the Constituent Assembly. But after the Kornilov affair, Kerensky declares a Russian republic. So, and at that point, Duke Michael, I think his quote was, "I don't care what kind of government it is, basically, as long as it works." So I don't think Michael is going to be upset by the declaration of the Russian Republic, which I think it's pre-October Revolution, so it's still going to happen. What I do see Michael being interesting, one, Evan has a good point. He's the sort of remaining scion of the Romanov family. Because at this point, I think Nicholas and Alexandra, they're just going to want to hang out with little Alex.
I mean, technically, they are still around, and I think they will survive this. But I 100% agree that, like, they're.
But Michael is.
The historian looks at them and is like,
I mean, Rasputin is gone at this point still.
But the important thing is.
Rasputin's not going to be doing anything to have the Romanovs act as weird as they did. They're just going to be happy doing their own weird Romanov things in the Urals.
But my point is Romanov family, this branch,
the whole thing,
this branch, this branch.
My point is that so Michael, one, is still around. Two, is going to be seen as kind of the conservative scion of the Romanovs, both for the Black Hundreds with their sort of like staunch monarchists, but also just kind of in general the conservative faction that ends up developing in the Constituent Assembly.
Well, at the very least, he's at least a figurehead. I mean,
I think he's actually more than a figurehead because he's he's independently wealthy. So Michael has the largest sugar plantation in Russia. Like he has millions of dollars. So what I think ends up happening. Yeah, well, I think he has so many rubles that it still ends up being millions of dollars. But yes, but what I'm getting at is Michael is one, a Romanov. He's still a Grand Duke. He's probably the most functional Romanov in terms of actually doing his public duty for Russia. I think he actually might end up, not immediately, but maybe a year or two down the road, winning an election to the Constituent Assembly. You can become
kind of a George Washington sort of figure who's so unwilling to actually want to take the reins of power.
I was thinking like a Ted Kennedy.
Let me pull.
That's fair.
No. You said I'm not. Did you mean to poke the bear? So
no, I poked the Chappaquiddick.
But I just want to kind of bring us back to like timelines so we understand all of this.
Yeah,
Lenin's not in Russia.
Yeah.
They don't do another of those wonderful moments. The October Revolution on November 7th.
In November.
Yeah.
But right after that, in November of 1917, were the elections to the Constituent Assembly.
Yeah.
Which was what everybody was waiting for. Everybody who's not a Bolshevik, Michael, the other revolutionaries, everybody had said, all right, listen, that is politics is on pause until this body sits. Everybody had the understanding that this will be an elected body and this will actually have legitimacy. So that election happened. It actually happened in our timeline. It just happened.
It was dissolved by the Bolsheviks after they took power like 3 months later.
Also, the election
It was a
happened
classic
in
case of, okay, let's have an election. Oh, it didn't go so well. Okay, no more elections.
No more elections.
They met for one day and then they dissolved it.
And the elections also happened with Red Guards standing outside of half the polling places.
Yeah.
And even with that, the Bolsheviks could not win this election.
Yeah.
So that happens. They sit at the beginning of January 1918. And let's go from there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I agree.
they win the election. Just me personally, I imagine it's probably going to be kind of a broad spectrum, probably a small majority or at least a large plurality is the kind of cadet social liberal, like the Western style Republican type Russian governments with some Menshevik kind of democratic socialists support.
Yeah. And also, just so I'll jump in here as well, because I don't think we said this during the podcast proper, but we talked about this a lot during the pre-podcast. If, for those who aren't familiar, there isn't just one monolithic socialist communist Russian group. When you study this period in history, you'll learn there's a lot of little opposing factions with various views and beliefs, but there's also kind of like just broader big tent sort of factions. So the two main ones that are more of the, communist ilk, not the socialist ilk, because the socialists are also another, side in this as well, is you have the Bolsheviks, which is, in our timeline, what Lenin headed up, what led to the Soviet Union, because they succeeded. But the other major faction, or is what Dylan just mentioned, are the Mensheviks. When you look and study, Marxism, Marxist theory, Marx himself, who, by the way, I'll just pause it for our listeners, was a German. That will be important as we wrap back to what Lenin is doing in Germany during this whole period in time. But Marx posited that we need to have a class struggle. We need to have a world revolution. We need to overthrow the bourgeois. We need to have a proletariat revolution. But originally, like core Marxism is there has to be two stages to this revolution. There is an institution of a democratic sort of style of government where the bourgeois are going to be able to, lead things, rule things, become the oppressors, which then own property, all those sorts of things.
There's two sides to all of it. There's a political revolution and the economic revolution. And the Marxist idea is you're going to have a political revolution where, and I want to be very clear on what Marx said the bourgeois was. The bourgeois were the educated.
It's like white collar people.
Middle class. Yeah. And by the way, largely middle class. And the idea that they, kind of what happens in the French Revolution, are going to push a revolution and are going to instill a government that supports them. Probably going to be democratic in character because there are enough of them to win elections. But the economic side of it is going to be, hey, capitalism and competition. Marx's idea then is that competition is going to lead to monopoly. And once you get to monopoly and that level of capital accumulation, you're going to drive out all of those white collar workers. You're going to basically, instead of having skilled blacksmiths, skilled tailors, skilled weavers, you're going to have factory workers. You're going to have people that own the factory and people
who own the means of production.
Yeah.
That's where that phrase comes from.
Basically, once that economic side of it reaches full accumulation, you no longer have enough bourgeois people. The bourgeois almost gets competed out of this. So that now you only have the capitalists and the workers. And at this point, the workers now outnumber the capitalists, and either through the democratic means or just through completely outnumbering them, that's how they seize the means of production.
Yes. Yeah. And so the Mensheviks are of this more... Yes, the Mensheviks are more of this traditional Marxist strain, who they believed that at this point in Russia's history, they need to start producing a democratic, that middle stage, I'll call it, this democratic republic, in essence. Lenin was a part of the Bolshevik and led the Bolshevik faction who strongly believed that based upon the structure of Russia's economy and their social hierarchy, the peasant class was already at that point that they could outnumber this, this ruling elite that it, described in Marxist theory. They can just skip, they can pass go, they can collect $200, although there would be no collection of $200 because it's our, there's no private property here.
We collect $200.
We collect $200 and we can just skip right and go ahead and start instituting the people's dictatorship. Well, in this timeline, the Bolsheviks are, for, all intents and purposes, mostly sidelined. And again, Lenin's not leading them. So we have Kerensky, who has the Republic, who wants to take Russia towards more of this, democratic ideal for the sake of democratic ideals, versus the Mensheviks, who are more than happy to have this liberal Republican Russia, but it's for an end goal. It's for an end purpose, for eventually turning it into a more Marxist communist regime. So I feel like that setup is very important here in determining what happens moving forward, because a lot of people, when we, and myself included for a while, when we look at this point in history, we just kind of view the Bolsheviks as being equivalent to the communists, which is what ended up happening. But at this point, there's actually two different factions of communists.
Yeah, and the important thing is, I think,
so many different factions.
Yeah, there's actually
there's
probably
so
like
many
16.
factions. Yeah.
But the important thing is, so there's going to be at least some broad spectrum across the political sort of, left, right, traditional spectrum of people that buy into at least the immediate constituent assembly. Now, a significant chunk of that constituent assembly, both from the left and the right, only buys into it because they have ulterior motives for trying to get it to go away. But they are going to buy into it. From the left, the Menshevik side of things, kind of, they see it as a necessary intermediate stage to a socialist communist revolution. From the right, you get your kind of czarist conservative, not Republican conservative, but autocratic conservatives, who I think are going to see this constituent assembly almost in the same potential as a Napoleon III, where they use that as an opportunity.
The best bulwark against a full-scale revolution where we lose our estate.
Well, that and the potential for using, much like how Napoleon III did in 1849, I want to say, is when he got elected.
1852 is when he does his coup.
Yes. Yeah. 1848 he's elected, 1852 is the coup. But that same idea where you use the Republican institutions to reverse the Republican institutions to go back to what it was before. So, end of the day,
the Republican institution to defeat the Republican institution.
Yes, exactly. So 1918, the Constituent Assembly dawns with a Democratic Republican mandate that exists, but at least probably 60% of the body knows that it is shaky at best long term in terms of their ulterior motives. So we have a democratic Russia, but the long-term outlook is questionable. But at least for right now, everybody's like, yay, we have a government. Everybody mostly has bought into it. Now that gets us to 1918. The big thing that's on everybody's mind all over the world is, this war that's going on. So that, if you have a constitutional Russian Republic who stays into the war, formally at the very least, all the way until Versailles, that then gets into some interesting stuff of, okay, what ends up happening with Versailles with the Russians also at the table? Chris, I'm sure you have some thoughts on that, so I want to hear what you got first.
Well, first I want to pick up, I said we were going to go off on our fork. I do want to kind of pause and bring it back to our timeline for a couple of things.
Yeah.
First, we talked about the turnip winter. Literally a week before, I want to say, and I'm looking at, no, it was after the February Revolution, the United States declares war. The United States is in this war, but not in this war. Just like we're talking about Russia still being in the war on paper, but they're not doing a whole lot of fighting. The United States is in this war on paper, but we don't have a lot of troops to do any fighting with. And what winds up happening in our timeline is we start a draft, we send over some troops, and we're slowly building up. But the reason I'm being a little pedantic and trying to jump back and forth is because all of this stuff happens at about the same time. And it's really important to understand like all of the different forces happening, because in March, the Bolsheviks finally signed a peace treaty. Immediately, the Germans put millions of troops that had been guarding this massive Eastern Front, put them on trains, shipped them to the West, and basically launch a last-ditch offensive to try and break through and conquer France before the Americans can actually build up.
Yeah, this is the Kaiserschlacht, right?
This is the Kaiserschlacht. Mm-hmm. They are not successful, but one of the things we've kind of been dancing around, and I want to say is, sitting in trenches is actually kind of safe, all things
considered,
considering the alternative. And it's one of those things of, well, the Germans, they were actually, if you look at this Kaiserschlacht, they're making advances that have never been heard of before on the Western Front. They're actually taking ground, but because they're out of their trenches, they're taking massive casualties. And that kind of sets up where what we're familiar, for those of us, honestly, in America that are familiar with this at all, we're familiar with the offensive at the very end of the war, where there's finally some Americans around, where we and the British and the French just constantly are hitting them everywhere, and eventually that leads to the end of the war. That doesn't happen here because you don't have the Kaiserschlacht. They do not have the troops that they just pulled out of Russia. So one, you've actually got the United States having to fight trench warfare, which is not against a full-size German army, which is not what happens in our timeline. In our timeline, just as Americans, we don't really understand it because we don't have that lived experience in any way similar to what the British and the French have been doing. In this, we might, and that's not a good thing. But also, getting back to kind of what we think, and I'm just going to say what I think happens. Maybe spring 1919, Germany just, like I said, the turnip winter happened. Germany can't feed itself and winds up suing for peace. It collapses just because, like I was saying earlier, that idea of if the West can just stay in the war, that's what happens.
Well, and you if Germany goes through another winter, you would have already seen, I think Bulgaria was the first one to capitulate. So they're going to see the writing on the wall as other people in the Mediterranean front start bowing out regardless.
It's Mediterranean and the Middle East.
Yes.
Jerusalem falls, Christmas 1917, they wind up taking Damascus. Like, pretty soon you're going to be in Turkey, and Turkey's going to surrender. When Turkey surrenders, like, your southern front is just
yeah. So, well, the consolidation, the Allied consolidation happens. But what a thought that's been running in my head basically this entire time, Chris, as you've been setting this up, and this is what I think we're kind of leading ourselves to, is we get to Versailles, and what really becomes so, pivotal in our timeline that comes out of Versailles is, in summary, basically, Germany's blamed, is forced to make all of these huge economic reparations, and a certain Austrian painter who is, mustard gassed by the British during the course of World War One, essentially starts, as basically as he's in this hospital, lost his voice, temporarily blinded. This is when he sees what happens with the Treaty of Versailles. This is when the seeds of Mein Kampf and all of these, this grand sense of German aggrievement. This is what happens as a result of Versailles. If we have a Germany that basically, sues for peace, comes to the table, guys, we're starving, like we can't do this anymore. We have Americans who are participating in trench warfare, who are they're going to be coming back from this war, to put it mildly, all manners of messed up. Like to psychologically, Kai had a really excellent discussion, and I'll have him, opine on this in a minute if he wants to, during the pre-podcast, talking about the psychology of trench warfare in World War One, which I think is really interesting to think about. But I think just purely on like a psychological level, and just on a level of, okay, Germany's coming to the table because they're starving and literally can't do this anymore. I think, and Russia's still in the fight. Russia wasn't knocked out. We're all hunkered down in our trenches, and we're basically just whoever is the first one to blink, whoever is the first one to cry uncle, is going to sue for peace. So this is the question I'm going to posit to the show. And I think I have my idea on this, but I just want to set this up and see where it goes from here. Do we think the terms of the Treaty of Versailles are either fundamentally different, or just the tone and the tenor of the Treaty of Versailles is different? And I don't know if it would be, but I want to throw this to the panel. Do we think anything necessarily changes that leads to very juicy stuff down the line with, the Austrian painter, the creation of, and we said this in the pre-podcast as well, the Weimar Republic? Does the Weimar Republic happen in this alternate timeline? Or, as Kai posits, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, but again, setting things up for discussion, does Russia kind of end up becoming more of this sort of Weimar Republic entity in the alternate timeline?
So that's what
I'm done with the setup.
So go for it, Kai.
So Evan just postulated that the Versailles Treaty is what leads the Austrian painter to paint. And I'm going to say that is not the deciding factor here. And Evan just breached it, and I've been wanting to breach it for a while here, because I think it's important. We have in this timeline, we have a war-torn country, savagely beaten, economically in shambles.
What are we talking about? I just need to be very clear.
This is the point, Chris. I'm trying to paint two pictures and then tell me what country it is. You're preempting me. We have a war-torn country. It just goes to show how well you know your history. You're exactly going to my point. We have a war-torn country that has been savagely beaten, economically disparaged. The monarchy is overthrown. We have far left and far right-wing parties vying for control amidst a central government that is weak and without order and without function. Am I talking about Weimar Germany, or am I talking about alternate timeline Russia? And that's the point.
Yeah.
We have a Weimar that is not Weimar, but Petrograd. And I think that is even more impactful than whether the Versailles Treaty has different clauses and whether Germany is punished harsher or not. We have a situation where Russia is undergoing the same sort of tumult, is under the same sort of pressures that Weimar Germany was under. And we even talked about it in some really prophetic ways. We talked about how the Russian monarchy would come back to power. Of note, in Weimar Germany, the right-wing parties were monarchist parties. So we have a situation where we're trying to figure out, is the Russian monarchy going to come back? And if so, how is it going to do it? Is it going to be, William? Was it, if that was his name? I can't remember.
Michael.
Michael comes back via.
I understand you think they're British. Like everybody's either a William or
a William, a George. Yeah, William or George.
Yeah.
But yeah, like we have a situation that's very similar to what's going on in Weimar Germany. And so I have to wonder whether what happened in Germany is just a matter, it is just a function of the fact that it was the first to undergo such a situation, and that in our time, in the alternate timeline, we have a situation where Russia is undergoing those same pressures, but earlier.
Two things really quick. First of all, Russia's on the winning side this time.
Yes.
So that's a huge difference. We're still going to have a lot of the pressures that happened to Weimar Republic Germany, but Germany was on the losing side in our timeline. So I think there's a big difference there. Secondly, I think two things can be true at the same time. I think that we can have a question about what happens with the terms of the Versailles Treaty and whether that changes things, because, as we'll get into here, I think in short order, we still got the wild card of Lenin in the picture. And what is he doing and what is he up to this entire time? Chris, I yield the floor. And Dylan also has something to say.
Dylan.
So to get back to the question of does Versailles change? I think specifically if you're talking about the Treaty of Versailles, which is only one of like 5 treaties that got signed in Versailles, I think the answer is no. I will instead throw out 3 others that might. Trianon, Saint-Germain, Sèvres. And I think especially...
So explain those.
So the Treaty of Saint-Germain is the one that functionally created German Austria. So that is one half of what basically broke up the Austrian Empire. The other one is Trianon, which is dealt with the Hungarian side. So Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, bits of Poland, bits of Romania, what was later on Yugoslavia, all mishmashed together.
Yeah, and I love the way you did that, Dylan, where you said that Saint-Germain dealt with just the rump Austrian state, and Trianon dealt with just what is Hungary, because the Austro-Hungarian Empire had a lot of other stuff going on. They had Italians, they had Czechs, they had Slovaks, they had Poles, they had Romanians, they had Bosnians, they had, I believe, I haven't done Croats yet. They have some Serbian. I cannot name them all.
They were the giant hot mess of Yugoslavia before that was cool.
Yeah, and the reason why I'm going
Yugoslavia
there is...
was part of that.
Yugoslavia was all part of that.
Just part of it. There's still a lot.
And that's the reason why I wanted to bring it up, because so you've got, Versailles gets all the credit because Germany is the one that ends up really taking it on the nose. But in terms of the practical impact, Austria is the most impacted because they literally no longer exist. And the reason why that is important in a Russia who is still at the table is because all of these other territories that the Austrian Empire encompassed, the bits of Poland, Czechoslovakia, especially in the east, once you start getting kind of on the outer edges of Hungary and kind of Romania, all of that is historically for the last 200 years, since Catherine and Peter, the czars of Russia, Austria and Russia have been kind of butting heads over this kind of idea of the sort of protector of the Serbs.
By the way, can we say, we haven't even mentioned this. The land we're talking about right now and Russian interest in it is actually what started the war.
Yes. All of this is the full circle moment. So a Russia that's at the table in Versailles, even if they don't care about the Treaty of Versailles, they're going to care about definitely Trianon and possibly also Sèvres, because let's not forget, only 50 or 60 years before this, we had the Crimean War. So I think, Russia's territorial ambitions, whatever they are, I think directly are only going to extend to maybe some stuff kind of in getting into the Balkans, a little bit more territory, but especially if they can find any other opportunities to get more warm water territory in the Black Sea.
Well, they're going to try and get Poland, directly. Poland, I feel, is going to become a big deal to them, and they're going to, in our timeline, we have Germany and Russia basically partitioning Poland in the lead up to World War II. That's
Poland is going to be, Yeah, but Poland's not going to be direct Russian territory.
I think, yeah,
But
no,
they're
I
going to
think
be a
I think
puppet state.
there'll be a puppet state for sure.
Or they're going to be, if not an outright puppet, they're going to be very.
No. Remember, the vast majority of Poland was Russia.
Yeah.
And administratively, there was the Duchy of Warsaw. So I think it may be in personal union because basically, if you've got elections in whatever Russian state we have, you know what? You don't want Polish voters.
Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, and also keep in mind, we're talking about Poland, which as modern listeners, we know of as the state that's like right next door to Germany that comprises a lot of what was, Prussian territory.
Yeah.
The Poland we're talking about now and like the interwar World War I, World War II period is more further
It's
east.
more eastward. It's
Yeah,
lot of it is
what I would call
Belarus.
Belarus today. Yeah.
It's for this reason that so many Polish towns have German alternate names.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like Gdansk was Danzig.
Yeah, it's Danzig.
Right.
Yeah.
Danzig.
By
you have
the way, the wonderful thing, like today, literally in the news, you will hear about Russian strikes in Lvov or Lviv or Lemberg.
Yeah.
Because it has 3 or 4 different names.
Yeah. Yeah, and
so-
Russia has Kaliningrad, like in our timeline, and they use that as basically a giant hunk of land that is a surveillance state on all the NATO countries,
which is the original Ostpreußen Teuton territory
I was going to say
that Prussia started from before it was Germany.
Exactly right. So we're just essentially what I'm trying to say here is as we kind of start drawing this to a close. Originally, we dropped this threat very obliquely early in the episode, but I'm just going to say it for everybody's benefit right now. Not only did we anticipate this becoming a dual fork with different outcomes of the Lenin train, but I think with everything that we've developed here, because we haven't even gotten into what Lenin is actually doing during this whole time and what he might do leading up in the future, in this sort of post-Great War settlement, we're probably going to do a part 2 on this because there's a lot of meat left on the bone here to chew on.
Yeah.
So we never even talked. We never talked about a Stalin-free Soviet Union free world, and let alone a Stalin-free.
Exactly.
Oh, Stalin's still around. I have ideas
Stalin's
for him. Don't worry.
No, we gotta. We'll develop that in the next episode. Let's figure out a good way to touch this down, though, because we have the treaties. We have these different definitions. Well, not different definitions, but we have in our timeline, this is Austria, this is Hungary, this is Bulgaria, this is like all of these different countries. What is different about that in this timeline?
In the interest of bringing everything together and checking off every single box I possibly can.
Oh boy, here we go.
I feel like we need to talk about friend of the pod, Woodrow Wilson.
Yes,
friend of the pod. That's what we're going to call
friend of the pod. We love us some Woodrow Wilson, don't we? Yes, we do.
Because I don't know if Romanians are white yet. And that's a legitimate question.
Literally, yeah, according to Woodrow Wilson, yeah.
According to Wilson.
But I think he does say, all right, we need some national self-determination. And I think that might come into conflict with some of what Russia wants. But
I think the way it would work is like what they did with Belgium. So where as part of the treaty, they create Belgium and then give them the opportunity to have a referendum on whether they, in Belgium's case, rejoin Germany. I think especially with Poland or parts of Poland and some of the other kind of Romanian external Hungarian territories where there are a lot of historic Russian people, I think that's probably the way that they structure it. They say, okay, in these territories, we're going to create an independent state, but we recognize these territories, there is a historic Russian population. In the interest of Woodrow Reed, secretly Edith Wilson's interest in the free determination of peoples, a League of Nations that doesn't completely fall apart at the first sign of a gun, we're going to give these Russian territories a similar plebiscite. I suspect most of them would vote to rejoin either Russia proper or a sort of like Belarusian puppet conglomerate. I suspect that's how this is going to change. Plus,
I think that's how
the
it
Russians are going to
changes.
screw the Ottomans somehow and take more something on the Black Sea. I just don't know what.
Well,
We'll get to that one. We can get to that next time.
We'll get to that next time. Yeah.
You know what? You got 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Actually, 3 out of 4 ain't bad.
Yeah, 3 out of 4.
Saint Germain, Trianon, Sevres.
Yep.
Sevres we'll save for later.
Yeah, 100%.
We'll separate that for next time.
And that's
We had to get in a bad
your
time.
mic, Dylan. That may not make it into the episode. I'm sorry.
Oh boy. Yes. What a shame. What a shame. All right, gentlemen. Well, executively as today's host, I think I will declare that to be a good spot to leave some threads hanging that we can pick up again readily for the next episode. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in to this installment of A Fork in Time. If you have any sort of feedback for us on this episode or any other episode in our pretty extensive back catalog, we would love to hear it. We have our Discord. We, have several ways you can reach out to us. And before I issue the final how we like to end things off, are there any last minute thoughts or ideas that we want to get out there? Akai, I did say about the World War I psychology thing. If you want to give maybe just a brief overview of that, because I think it's kind of interesting.
Oh, it's not anything of mine. It's just I've listened to a podcast that I really like. I guess we maybe can put it in the show notes. It has nothing to do with history. It's more of like a science podcast, but it was talking about the psychology of the game theory involved in World War I trench warfare, and how both sides were exhausted to the point of complete they lost interest in fighting each other.
Checking
So
out.
they developed
Out.
They basically the foot soldiers developed a system where they would communicate with each other through various nonverbal means, establishing an equilibrium that would basically mean that they wouldn't actually fight each other, but they would pretend that they were to fool the officers. And so I just thought that was a super interesting topic, and I guess we could probably put it in the show notes. And of course, it was relevant because it fueled that sort of stagnancy that was characteristic of World War I.
Yes.
But it's also slightly heartwarming in a lot of ways.
Indeed. Yes, for sure. I'm sure some of our listeners are very aware of the heartwarming stories of the soldiers just getting out of the trenches and playing soccer every Christmas and things like that.
Yeah, but that was overt. That was an overt gesture. This is all about the covert gestures of hey, we're going to shoot the barn wall 2 times. That indicates that we're switching shifts or something. And there was very subtle communications that were picked up and established without any verbal communication whatsoever. Very fascinating, very interesting, very heartwarming. And of course, the Christmas truce is just the culmination of that.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, if anybody else doesn't have something else they want to throw in here, cool. Then I think we'll call it there. So if you happen to stumble across a fork in the road of time, what do you think we should do with that?
Figure out what month it's in, put it on a sealed train, and send it off to seize the means of production.
Yeah, that's a problem.
Yeah, pretty much exactly.
Yes, exactly.
All power to the 48.
Well, the usual answer I look for is just take it. But in the spirit of this episode, I think I agree with that assessment. Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone, and have a good one.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.